listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I am joined today by John Fitzgerald. John is the EVP of Ad Sales at DAX USA, which is part of the global company. John, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Heather, and thank you very much for having me.
So, John, you and I recently met at a podcast movement, and I was really kind of blown away by the history that you've had in the advertising space and in the podcast space. Tell us a little bit about how you got into podcasting.
Yes, no, thank you, Heather. And first of all, it was a pleasure speaking with you at that panel and being at that conference. It had been the first podcast conference I had been at for quite a few years. And it was a great reminder for me and for my company, DAX US, who I represent today, of how far podcasting has come and the tremendous scale and variety and value that podcasting provides to consumers and thus to the advertisers who wish to speak to those consumers. But I've been in the advertising field for coming on 30 years, which is a little frightening to say. But I started at ABC Radio, part of the Disney company, back in 1996. And I started in the audio, on the audio side, and quickly moved over to the ESPN side and represented all of ESPN's national audio product. And the thing about ESPN, which was why I was able to get into and learn and watch podcasting early on, was ESPN was a firm believer in kind of serving the sports fan wherever and whenever they wanted to listen or watch or talk about sports. And so as we were building out the ESPN radio network, almost immediately we got into podcasting. And in the beginning, the podcasting was the simple, let's rip the best of Mike and Mike off the radio show and put that up in a slightly condensed fashion that someone who missed their morning drive or listening at work, they could catch up with it. But as we know, podcasting, I guess, is around officially 20 years old, though I know there were versions of podcasting before. So about 20 years ago, ESPN recognized the opportunity, particularly with some talent who were not ready to do a radio show and everything that goes into a radio show, generally at that time, particularly long hours every day of the week, right? At least 5 days a week, or if you're a weekend host, 1 or 2 days a week. But they brought good value to the table, said interesting things, had interesting guests on, had interesting takes, but maybe more importantly, could not figure out how to work around radio's limitations in terms of the clock. That was really the first time that some of the ESPN talent started working on just podcasts. They had tried radio, didn't have the time for it because of other commitments that they might have had at ESPN, or they did not like this idea that just as soon as they got into the thick of a conversation, they had to go to either a local or a national break and stop the conversation. So in the beginning, we were a little nervous. What will this do, right? Will this take away from our audio listening, right? Will our radio numbers in essence go down? And at the same time, we were streaming, we were on Sirius XM, we were on various ESPN television channels, but we started to see that the more that we put out, the closer our relationship was being built with our fans and the more time they would spend with us. So it was really kind of a valuable lesson. Don't worry so much about where your content is, just worry about the content being the best it could be. And then you'll eventually be able to gather up your audience and they'll be with you at certain times of the day in various channels, and you'll be more valuable for your advertising partners. And that was important to understand for me about the value of podcasts for the advertising partners. Because then the second thing that we saw there was, obviously, we could do certain things in the advertising space, because that's what this podcast is about, in podcasts that was getting harder to do in radio, again, because of the limitations of the clock. And even if you did stuff in content, we did things in content all the time, you didn't want that partnership to take over the entire show, right? And so that the listeners felt like the show was just really like an infomercial for our advertising partners. It was essential to make it feel authentic within the show. And in podcasting, because there was no clock, it was easier for us to spend a little bit more time talking about our advertising partners and perhaps speaking about the advertising partner's relationship with that host, right?
Mhm.
So in the beginning, we were very much everything we do is host reads, it's baked in, sort of lives everywhere for everything. And that's what we did for the first number of years at ESPN. And then over time, we started recognizing the value of perhaps DAI, dynamic ad insertion, and being able to pull ads out when their flight was
Mhm.
over. In the beginning, honestly, it was the advertiser who brought that to our attention, right? They're like, look, if we're selling something or there's something coming out and then it goes away, we can't have someone go pull up a show because they like a guest or a subject matter 3 months later and then asking us, where is that special or where is that sale? So, we started thinking about that and the value of that. So then over time, as our podcast network grew, so did our thinking about how we could serve our advertising partners. So
Mhm.
that was my first interaction with podcasting. Again, very much content driven,
Which I
host read
love.
driven.
I love that.
And I think, Heather, as we get in later about targeting and networks and audiences, that's just an important point I want to make. While the
Mhm.
value that we bring today at DAX US is different than the value that I experienced and brought out to the advertising community at ESPN and then my time at Odyssey, it doesn't mean I think one is better than the other, right? I think they all bring tremendous value to the table. It's just that since that 20 or so years ago that I experienced the growth of podcasting, by no means drove it, right? I was just on the advertising side that I believe it has evolved so much, as we spoke about at the panel, that there are various things various levers that advertisers should be pulling, utilizing to take advantage of all the variety, all the scale, all the opportunity in podcasting. But yeah, no, when I grew up in the space, it was very much about content plays that made sense for certain people and using the host to drive that partnership and that connection between our advertising partners and our fans.
Well, and I think that the point that you make about it being content driven is such a valuable perspective because as we are looking at the further evolution of podcasting, I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, but I really believe what we're finding is that advertisers are saying, hey, we're not only interested in your podcast, but we're also interested in your YouTube channel. We're interested in your social. We're interested in your newsletter. And the reality is that it is all content driven, right? These content creators have amassed an audience around them that consume this valuable content and then bringing that advertising partner alongside to support that content creation and then of course also support that advertiser is it's a really important piece and I think that for you and I, having spent 20 plus years in advertising, when we got into the advertising space, the internet didn't even exist, I don't
Right.
think, and so we were so ingrained that it was like the big three, like TV, radio, and newspaper. And so there was this connection between like it has to be in one of these major outlets in order to really have power. But that is just not the case anymore.
No.
And the further and further we get to technological advancements and just the quantity of platforms that are available out there, everything is becoming more dispersed. And so it does come back to maybe less about the platform in a lot of ways and more about the content. What are your thoughts about that?
I think you're correct. It's about the content, it's about the content creator and
Hmm.
the influence they have on their
Right,
community.
right.
I think one of the things that we've seen in podcasting, because it is not very expensive to be able to build a good sounding and an enjoyable viewership product, that so many people with so many interests can come into the space, right?
Hmm.
So I know there are a lot of numbers out there, but let's just say there's 5 million podcasts in the United States that you can listen to. It's literally every interest level in every community. Meaning that if I am interested in something going on in my neighborhood in Manhattan, there are podcasts that I have found about that. But if
Hmm.
I am interested in things state level, national level, global level, universal level, all of those things exist for me within literally every type of interest level,
Hmm.
right? It doesn't need to be, we talk so often about it's news, it's sports, it's comedy, it's true crime, what have you. But no, there's literally something for everybody inside there.
Hmm.
So I think that that's also a point of difference, right? Is that television for a long time was beholden to the transmitter, right? Radio is beholden to the transmitter. Really, the digital revolution, which we're now far into, and now we're perhaps moving into the cloud revolution,
Hmm.
allowed that to stop.
Hmm.
So while those content creators, specifically broadcast, TV and radio, had to attempt to speak to as many people as possible. Podcasters have been given the freedom to speak to what they want, what they're expert on, what their passion is, and then build the community that way. And again, whether it is through an audio listen or a view, whether it is social drops or events, all of that is capable. But you could have someone that speaks specifically to horticulture in the Southeast, right? And there are enough people that are interested and excited about that. They can build a community and there's value there, right?
Hmm.
So then it becomes, so how do you reach out to those people? And I think it depends on how do you utilize those podcasts if you're an advertiser to better your relationship with your customer or your consumer target. And so I think it's one of the great opportunities that exist in podcasting, and that it's really about community, service of community, and you being able to have an authentic relationship with that community. So you could do it a couple ways, right? You can partner directly with that podcast. So let's go to the horticultural show in the Southeast, and you're a flower shop in the Southeast. You serve somehow that community. You go to an expert agency, such as your own or other agencies that know where to find these people, and you build up a podcast investment around that, right? Or you think about the fact that, well, again, there are 5 million podcasts. It's gonna be hard to track all of that down. Do I do an investment with a network that allows me to target by genre and by interest level, right? I think that that's one of the things that's changed over the last few years, right? That's what we spoke to in the panel, and that's really sort of where DAX US sits as a network provider and a representative of podcast creators and networks, is that there are other ways to think about investing to reach that flower enthusiast, right? Or sports enthusiast or car enthusiast or home buyer throughout different parts of the United States. That there is the technology and the structure exists now that allows us to target in ways that we didn't have, say 5, 10 years ago.
Right, right. Well, and I think that the important piece is that when you're advertising on that one horticulture podcast, as much as that audience is very dedicated to that show, very dedicated to that host, there are a limited number of people that are actually listening to that podcast. And so I think the important piece here is the scale piece. And, I think when we think back about embedded ads, and you brought that up, and I like to try and bring up embedded versus dynamically inserted ads in nearly every podcast episode I do, as my listeners will know. But the reason that I think it's such an important conversation is not that embedded advertising isn't valuable. Of course, it's valuable. But, to your point, advertisers want to have this ability to have their ad out there for a certain specific period of time, because we know then that ad is actually going to be relevant to the listener. But then also there's all of the other pieces that go along with dynamic ad insertion, which is this ability to really target a certain listener and to be able to target a certain person at scale. And so I think that piece is part of the reason that it is so valuable. And while we have, varying degrees of advertisers in the space, we have brand direct buys where maybe we're working with all different sizes of companies and what their needs are. And then we've got the direct response agencies that have specific needs. As we think about growing the industry and as we think about more of the high level brands and really what they're trying to create, they need this ability to say, hey, we're going to target this specific listener with a specific message. And to your point, now that is available. I'm curious what your thoughts are about how just that piece, which is such an important piece, is really impacting the industry.
Yeah, and look, I think that if we're going to grow podcasts as piece of the investment pie, and I know I was listening to one of your recent podcasts, might have been the most recent one, where you spoke about some of the revenue reports that have just come out, specifically, I think IAB's podcasting
Mhm.
revenue report, and how we didn't hit the numbers we would like and thought we might hit this year. I think if we're truly going to do that, it's going to be essential for us to offer all in unison, if possible, the same opportunities to invest in podcasting that advertisers have in the video and the rest of the audio space. If you think about how they buy what they call radio and streaming radio, right? Radio and streaming audio. They have and we'll use a national advertiser. Here's a national advertiser. They specifically want to reach this group of people. This is what we know about this group of people. They really like this kind of genre. They tend to be in these areas of the United States, and we have a message that we feel will connect with this consumer target. We just need to be in the right places with it, right?
Mhm.
So often, as they go through the buying cycle, right, planning and then investment with a good agency partner, and there's dozens and dozens of them in the United States, is that they will first figure out, okay, what are the shows and perhaps the talent that resonate the most with this audience? Hey, let's go see if we have the ability to do some sort of level of exclusivity and perhaps a DJ host endorsement rate, right? So they kind of start at that level. And then they're like, and perhaps maybe there's some sponsorships of something like sports or along the lines. It's like, okay, that gets us that top level authentic partnership. But even the biggest show only reaches a small fraction of the potential listener base, right? So then they start talking about, okay, let's buy into these stations that make sense. Now, how do we buy into these stations, right? We can go out and pick and choose every individual station, or perhaps what we should do is look to our network radio partners and build out a network that targets that audience and will negotiate the delivery of that audience with those radio network representation companies. Meaning we need to reach this type of person. How do you suggest we should reach that type of person? Let's negotiate against that. We talked about, I think, in the panel on the video side, you're buying a big sponsorship in something like the Super Bowl because you want to reach as many people as possible. But then you go and you buy a cable buy, which because it's like your audience tends to watch these sort of cable networks and genres. But then you go and you buy your targeted video buy, right, on OTT and YouTube and things like that. So we're doing this everywhere else. Why are we not doing this in podcasting, right? So still do your reads that you feel like will be the most impactful for you. Again, if you can find an authentic relationship with the host. I know this is something you speak about, something I've thought about my entire career, and I think everybody needs to be wary of it. You can't have hosts that say they love one thing in a category one week and their competitor the next
Right.
week.
Right.
And again, you have to trust your agency, right? That they can work through that with the representation companies for those shows, right? So that's really important. But do that, and it will have great impact on you. But then think about, all right, now how do I spread out?
Mhm.
So I think there are two stats I've seen, and it's interesting how they get used, right? So I think stat that I've seen is that 88% of all listening falls outside of the top 500 podcasts, right? But everybody spends a lot of time on, I want to buy, forget about the top 500, I want to buy like top 50. So what
Mhm.
percentage of the potential audience could you really be reaching when 88% aren't even listening to those podcasts? An agency once said to me, just the way they were thinking about it was like, Well, 90% of listening is in the top 1% of podcasts. And he said, well, the top 1% of podcasts is 5,000 podcasts, right? If we're saying there's 5 million podcasts, it's 5,000. You don't cherry pick like 12 podcasts and be like, I'm all good. Like, we're done here.
Right.
You wouldn't do that with any other channel, right? You'd be like, what are all the levers I can pull to reach the most amount of people that will have interest in the company that I represent? And I think that's really important because we have to understand that, look, you have to have a great product. That's what the creators, the producers, that's what they do, right?
Mhm.
You have to market that product and distribute that product in the right ways, as many places as possible to build up your community. But when we're talking about advertising, our job is to serve the company, the
Mhm.
spender, right?
Mhm.
It is to make sure that the creator is comfortable with the advertisers on their show, but it's really to make sure that these people have a great experience with advertising and podcasts and come back and come back and come back. So I think it's just important for us to be like, yes, there are these shows, the larger shows, and they will have impact. That might be the show that your CMO listens to, right? Or someone on the board listens to, and they might say, hey, by the way, I heard a spot. I think that's great. But again, it's like even the larger show is just reaching a small fraction of the audience in the United States. And more importantly, reaching just a small fraction of who you need to reach.
Mhm.
It's great if a show has a million ADP, right? But how many of those people can actually buy the product or interested in the product that you have?
Mhm.
And I just think it's important to balance all out. That's where companies like DAX US, that's where we come to play today, which
Mhm.
is really concentrating on there are so many valuable shows out there in the mid and long tail. Let's bring that together for you and let's target those audiences. And if you need, target those audiences in a brand safe way. And again, now there's the technology to do that. So DAX US, we have a proprietary sales platform and SSP that we creatively call DAX Audio. And we're connected with all the major buying platforms.
Mhm.
And all of our network partners sit there.
Mhm.
So we can, because of that capability, and we're not the only ones, right? We're able to do targeting a variety of ways. And I
Mhm.
know that that's something that, you're interested in, you think about, and I think you wanted to talk about a little today.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. You covered so many important things there, and I think that one of the important pieces is the long tail. And I've heard so many stories, and I'm sure you have as well, where advertisers choose to advertise on these mega shows. And number one, they're really expensive, and number two, they're really cluttered, right? Like they have a lot of ads in them. I also just love that story about, yeah, you want to hit the top 1% of podcast listeners. Well, that is 5,000 shows. And no buyer, aside from maybe BetterHelp or some of the mega buyers in this space, are advertising on 5,000 shows, right? It's not really practical unless there's a ton of time and attention spent. And part of it is that facilitation of the host read, right? That is very time consuming. And while there is so much power in that, it is very time consuming. So just being able to scale is, I think, the most important piece. But also, as we've been talking about, really getting in and reaching the appropriate person. So, one of the things that I'm curious about is what level of targeting actually really does exist. Because I think we talk about it a little bit. Some people will say, well, there's no real targeting in this space, and we really don't have any good analytics about who's listening. But then on the flip side, we have conversations like we're having today where it's like, well, no, that actually does exist and you can do this. So tell us a little bit, if a buyer is looking to come and target something, some specific buyer, what does that process look like, and what are the levers they can pull to target their audience?
It's a great question, Heather. And I would preface probably my long-winded answer by saying you should tag your buys. You should
Hmm.
put attribution pixels on
Hmm.
everything that you
Absolutely.
do, and ideally on everything you do.
Hmm.
So, like your podcasting buy, your streaming buy, your video streaming buy, your social buy, you can put them all together and check the efficiency of them. Because I think that's often when you see the power of podcasting and audio in general, is that when it gets laid out with everything else. So we always challenge our buyers and our agencies, let's do that. How are you going to grade your homework, right?
Mhm.
Like, is it going to be about whether, again, that CMO heard the spot and they're happy? Or is it going to be like, what did they do? Was it driving brand awareness down to make an actual purchase? So that's a key thing because that's how it's going to prove out that it works, right?
Mhm.
Because there are some, not limitations, but there are some things inside audio listening where you have to make a leap on, okay, I think I'm reaching the right audience here, right? Because there's a lot of listening done for podcasts and audio in general, and things like smart speakers. They're extremely valuable, right? Because it's another easy way for consumers to listen to your content and access your content. So it's important that you're there. The
Mhm.
information you get is kind of general to like who purchased sort of the product, but that's starting to change and get better. But I think it is important to be like, maybe everything you have doesn't look exactly like what you had in video, right?
Mhm.
But there is nothing in advertising that is not assumptive, right? And that's another thing. It's like, why would you, if two-thirds of Americans are listening to podcasts on a regular basis and they have all this passion there, why would you spend all this time thinking about ways not to be in the space when your TV ratings are assuming the person who owns the TV is in the room watching the TV, right? Like, why is that okay? But
Right.
like, that's
Right.
why you're not going to get in podcasting, right? I think that's really important. So we say, look, why don't you tag everything?
Mhm.
Ideally, agency that has a good mixed media model that they can bring back results to. That's the most important thing because
Mhm.
I do believe that that will show that the power of podcast advertising. So
Mhm.
that said, so what can you do? Whether it is by locale or genre or audience targeting, all of that is available, right? Um, Ideally, you want to work with a company like DAX US that has the ability to have their own platform and have all, in our case, publishers that we represent on that platform. Why do you say that? Because there's a lot of different ways than you can target audiences, right?
Mhm.
So let's use maybe the most valuable tool, which is a company's own data, their first party data. So I'm not talking about a published subscribe data, someone that had a subscription when they lived in Chicago, like myself, and still gets served Chicago ads because that's when I set up my subscription 25 years ago.
Mhm.
The client's first party data. Can you work with a partner that can onboard that data, right? And then
Mhm.
start targeting that audience or omit that audience because you feel like you're in a good place with them. Can you create lookalike audiences around that first party data? We can do both those things. And then the third thing is, do they have partners that are either bringing data? We represent certain networks that have their own data that we're able to utilize and build out packages around. This is where we believe, again, that flower enthusiast is, right? Here's all the shows. This is what we know about these people. Or work with DMPs. For instance, we use Nielsen as a DMP service
Mhm.
as well as other things. And so we're able to build targeting and then get indexing against shows, right?
Mhm.
It's like, here are the shows that have the highest index against your target audience.
Mhm.
So we're going to serve you into these shows. Does that mean everybody inside every show is going to be that listens to your ad is going to want to buy your product at that time? No, but neither does anything else you do in the space,
Right.
really. So
Right.
again, why should podcasting, when it has so much power, so much scale, so much variety, be assigned to a different test than anything else? And then the other thing is that a lot of our agency partners are building up really powerful DMPs and DSPs themselves, right?
Mhm.
They have all of these records from all of these clients they work with. And as long as those clients approve, they can also provide us those records and we can integrate with those DMPs directly. And again, look to serve that audience. So there are so many levers that you can do that. And now there's these really strong brand safety focused companies, right? Because that's the other thing, right? Like, look, I know that some of the largest podcasts are so large, some companies are willing to forego some of the content in there may not be exactly what we would buy if we were buying on any of the channel. The others, though, are saying, like, I need to make sure that I'm in brand safe product. And there are all these good companies that have come out through transcription services, AI, other
Hmm.
things that can help you build with representation like ourselves, um, networks, bespoke networks that not only reach your audience, but are brand safe. Get into that mid and long tail, right? It's like get into all of those podcasts and make sure. So go by those shows if you can get in there an authentic, exclusive way for the host read, but then layer on the buys. And like the last thing is targeting buys, you have less waste and you're somehow getting it
Yep.
at a low CPM.
Yes. Okay. I want to go through some of the things that you said, but when we think about podcast advertising, and I feel like this is a bit of a duh moment for me because as long as I've been in the industry, we've talked so much about the effectiveness of podcast advertising. And I mean, not less than a year ago, I had someone on the show that was buying, it was an agency that they were buying multiple, mediums. And she said, well, we've found that when we run podcast advertising, our streaming video increases by 3%, the results. And it was such a light bulb moment for me because it's just the media mix is so important. And for some reason, and I think it's because the podcast space still feels like a newer type of advertising vehicle for so many that it's like, hey, we're gonna put this buy over here and we're gonna see how it performs. But that's not how advertising works. That's not how creating a brand works or creating brand awareness works. The reality is that everywhere you see that company, that consumer is getting the message of that company put into their minds, into their worlds. And so having multiple touches through lots of different, I think, platforms is important. Now, I will say that we could and do say that podcast reaches the unreachable. And I do think that that is possible and it happens. But the reality is, most everyone consumes social and video and audio, and the list goes on, right? Like most people are consuming multiple things. So being able to look at the media mix, I think, is really, really important. And as you said, working with an agency that can help you tag everything and really create a story about your results over all of your media mix is so super important. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And then I guess next I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of that show specific. So, when we think about buying like this, and I feel like there's always different conversations about, is this programmatic and what is the definition of programmatic and all of those nuances. But there are buyers that really are looking for a level of transparency. And I think that, that word has gotten thrown around a lot. Like, what kind of transparency do we have here with this buy? So I'm curious, when advertisers are buying with all of this targeting, what level of transparency is provided? Are they getting a list of the shows that their ads appearing on? How does that work?
Yeah, so I'd say until about 2 years ago, they were only getting kind of genres and maybe
Sure.
here are the top shows that run against, your bespoke, but no guarantee that you're going to be in those shows, right? But here's
Hmm.
the network we've built out
Hmm.
for you. Now we're going to feed into it. But over time, because of advancements and third-party partners coming to help us out, we now can provide show level and soon enough episode level data, right? And,
Wow.
and with episode level data, also transcription of what the show is. And again,
Mm.
this is podcasting has gotten to a size now that it can help hold up again a structure that allows you to do all of these things, right? The same
Hmm.
capabilities that digital video has had. It's like
Yeah.
I can show you where you're running and you can know what the show is about. And if you really have the time, you can read a transcript of certain shows if you're interested. And we're getting there. It's little by little, but
Hmm.
we can get to with certain providers and certain buys, we can get to those levels of show and episode is coming.
Hmm.
And I feel like that'll be a great breakthrough for it'll make it easier for our agency partners and those inside companies and advertisers that know the space matters to be able to get beyond well, I can only buy like these 5 shows. I got
Right.
these like 5 shows approved, and now I can move beyond it and add that to the table because I do think it is important, and it's been something that perhaps has slowed the progress of this evolution that we're
Hmm.
talking about.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then you brought up rate. So I think rate is really important. And like as you mentioned, you get all of these things and it's at a lower rate. So I know that right now, kind of in the host read space, we're seeing about an average of a 21, give or take CPM. I would say that that's very, very kind of run of the mill rate. What kind of rates would you say buyers should be looking at to try and buy this kind of programmatic targeting?
Like half to three-quarters of that rate that you
Hmm.
quoted. And again, everything is negotiable,
Yeah,
right? So, and I don't want to speak for every network, but
sure.
that's what we can provide. And again, the idea is, and that's why we talk about tagging so much, because it's not so much the rate as the effectiveness of the buy, right? And so we're like, look, you might be paying $50 for this podcast, but it's doing a tremendous job for you. Keep paying $50, right? Like if that what works for you, and then try this network targeting buy and tag that. And let's just make sure that, our value is the same. Our cost per acquisition, our ROI, return on investment, is the same. But generally you can get it in above streaming, but lower than most host rates.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, but I always feel like it's really important for us to say that there is power in the host read ad. And we're not necessarily saying, hey, go away from buying host read ads. There's value in that partnership. There's value in saying, hey, I know this host and they're a huge advocate for my product. They're going to try it, they're going to speak about it in a certain way. But really, it's the layering in of the targeting on top of host read where I feel like a lot of power exists because it's taking something that's working and it's really just doing it at scale.
Yeah, and it's empowering the advertiser not to be beholden to the
Yes.
top 2 shows in a category.
Right.
So, like, I can't tell you how many advertisers I've spoken to. They're like, "Oh, I'd love to use podcasting, but my competitor has grabbed these 2 shows, so I can't use podcasting." And you're like, "What are you talking about?" There are so many people that are listening inside that genre, not to those 2 shows, or are your target audience and are just listening to podcasts in general. You need to activate against podcasts as a channel, and the fact that it just reaches as many people as almost anything else in the United States, and they have a special relationship with that podcast, maybe more special than anything else that they spend time with.
Yeah.
You can argue, and again, this is the power of podcasts and those that created and push this. Thank you very much for this, right? Those who've done the work over the last 20 years, that relationship is almost unlike anything else in advertising. But by the way, it's not just the top 2 shows in the genre or the category. It's show number 50 and 102 and 6,000. The people who listen to those shows love those shows just as much. So think about that too and figure out ways to take advantage of the space and not again beholden to, well, I know this host.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, no one's like, "Oh, I watch every TV show that I buy," right? Like, I
Right.
watch everything on OTT,
It's
and I
true.
watch
It's true.
I watch everything on YouTube that I buy, right? I watch it all. It's the only reason we buy it is because those are the channels that I watch on YouTube. It doesn't make any sense, and I think it's important that we as an industry speak that way, and
Yes.
with that sort of comfort. I think at times, we concentrate so much on certain shows, we've done a disservice not only to all the great creators out there, but we have stifled potential investment.
Hmm.
Because it's like, oh, if I don't get these in these 10 shows, I guess I shouldn't buy it. And
Hmm.
that's ridiculous because
Hmm.
regardless of the size of a show, there's great value, but you're probably not going to go and spend all this time, like you were saying, picking and choosing 5,000 podcasts.
Right.
So why don't you think about other ways to access those channels?
Yeah. Well, we talk a lot about matchy as well, because I'm not saying that if you're a supplement company, you shouldn't advertise on a health and fitness podcast. But the reality is that sometimes what happens is a product wants to be so heavily attached to content that is perfectly aligned with their product. And, one of the thoughts that I always have is if you're a health enthusiast, chances are you're already taking a lot of supplements and that you've got those supplements dialed in. So advertising on that show may not be as effective as you think it's going to be. Or, another example, we work with an essential oil podcast, and we've really struggled with essential oil advertisers on that podcast because those people already buy their essential oils. They already have their diffusers. Like, they're not going to change their minds. But if you reach your profiled customer in a different place, somebody that's like, oh yeah, I've been thinking that like maybe I should buy essential oils, or I've been thinking about this, like, changing a hair care product or adding a supplement, that's where your customer is really ripe for the conversion.
Right.
And so it's really more about targeting the people want to buy your products and services, as opposed to saying you have to be on these specific shows.
Yeah, I mean, we contain multitudes, right? Like, I don't know anyone who only likes essential oils or only works on their car or only paints their house. It's like, it doesn't make any sense for you to only pull a very specific passion point.
Mhm.
Find the person and talk to them at various points of their life, at various points of the day in a variety of ways. Yeah, we're in complete agreement about that, Heather. Like, that's sort of DAX US, everything we think about is, shouldn't we be doing what drives your business forward and not like telling you what you should be using? Like,
Mhm.
you tell us, right?
Mhm.
Advertise, you tell us what you're trying to do. Let us build something out. And again, tag it and let's grade our homework together, right? Like, we're not going to tell you, oh, this is the only thing that will work for you. And by the way, it's just our reporting will show you, and we won't be part of larger reporting, and we won't let you tag our shows or anything like that. It's like, no, let's figure this out, because we want you, advertiser, to want to do more and more in this space,
Mhm.
because there is nothing like again, this will be most of my career has been in the audio space. We don't get enough money in general, right? All of audio and podcasting doesn't get enough money. It's like, how much larger and various and influential can these creators be, right? Before you start realizing, you need to pull some more money out of these other places that you reflexively go to and spend again and again and again. Like, and so I just think it's important for us to continue to bring solutions for the advertiser. And again, it might be, hey, 5 host reads. I feel like that's a good place for me to start. But in the end, we want to bring everything to the table.
Yeah, no,
So,
absolutely.
I guess
Yeah, absolutely. Well, John, I have loved our conversation today. Thank you so much for all of your insight and knowledge. If people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
you could follow us at our DAX LinkedIn page, and my email address is john.fitzgerald@global.com. And I want to thank you, Heather, for the opportunity to have this conversation. It was a pleasure when we were on that panel last month. It's been a pleasure today.
Thank you for being on the show, John.
Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope that you have enjoyed it as much as I have. If you haven't had a chance to check out my YouTube channel, please head on over there and watch the podcast over there. And I will catch you again next week. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.